Hi everyone, my name is Eduardo Flandes. I am PhD student in the Universidad de Chile, and today I will be presenting my work entitled Quantifying the magnetic reconnection between coronal hole boundaries and jets. This project was developed in collaboration with Dr. Vadim Muriski from Catholic University of America. The idea is quantify the degree of irregularity at the boundary of the coronal holes and then analyze how this irregularity changed before and after the jet eruption. To begin, I will show you the coronal hole on which our study is based. In particular, we focused in analyzing its boundaries. We specifically study a jet that emerged at the edge of coronal hole, and we interpret its evolution within the framework of the breakout model for solar eruptions. The methodology we use is based on the calculation of the correlation fractal dimension. In our case, we apply a spatially and temporally localized version known as correlation dimension mapping, or CDM, which allow us to quantify the level of irregularity along the boundary of the coronal hole. And finally, I will show you how we use CDM to locally quantify the regularity along the boundary and how this structure change as a result of the jet eruption under study. So we study a coronal hole in the equator. It is surrounded by two helmet streamer and one pseudo streamer. In the upper right panel, a red line outline the boundary of the coronal hole, defined according to a binarization threshold we applied. Naturally, changing this threshold altered the boundary of the coronal hole. However, we have been consistent with this criterion throughout the entire analysis. Precisely, defining the boundary at the coronal hole is challenging, as it depends on the wavelength used, is the height above the solar surface, and the viewing angle. For instance, the apparent boundary may vary when observing the same coronal hole with SDO versus solar orbiter. Nonetheless, we can say that the boundary approximately corresponds to the region separating open from closed magnetic field lines. The figures show the edges of the coronal hole in red on an AIA 193 Entron image. The white box marks the region of interest from which a coronal jet emerged. And the lower figure shows a HMA magnetogram indicating the same region of interest, but now at the photospheric level. So we analyze this jet, the evolution of this jet, which originates at the boundary of the coronal hole. And for this study, we use observation in three different wavelengths, AIA 193 in orange, 304 in red, and 171 in yellow. The peak of the event is observed at 22:38 Universal Time. So in the right figure, we show four stages for the jet evolution, driven by the mechanism of interchain reconnection. Inside the black ellipse, we observe a multipolar configuration. In red, at the center, a minority polarity, and in blue, we can see the majority polarity. And somewhere in between lies the polarity inversion line. This configuration forms a fine spine magnetic topology. In the left panel, we show the magnetic configuration derived from the PFSS model. The red lines indicate the fan spine topology, uh, while the yellow lines represent the magnetic field lines associated with the coronal hole boundary. Uh, we also identify closed and open magnetic field lines, as well as the null point, where the open and closed field lines are closed field line of the bipole connect. Subsequently, a current sheet forms as magnetic energy builds up in the system. This is where the filament channel forms. Then the breakout process occurs. At this stage, a breakpoint, uh, we observe a breakpoint followed by appearance of a flare arcade that emerges from the central positive polarity toward the majority polarity in blue. And finally, we can observe the helical structure of the jet emerging. So, our goal is to study how the boundary of the coronal hole varies locally in the region where the jets occur. Specifically, we aim to quantify change in the regularity of the coronal hole boundary within the region of interest. To, this, to, this, to do this, we use the correlation dimension mapping, which is based on the calculation of the correlation dimension, one of the fractal dimensions commonly used in the analysis of dynamical systems. The method involves selecting a point on any given perimeter and drawing concentric cycles of different radius around it. For example, in this figure, we show two curves, one in blue and one in orange. From a fixed point, we draw three different concentric cycles and count how many points of the curve fall within each cycle. It is easy to see that the blue curve contains more points within each radius than the orange one, indicating that the blue curve is more irregular. In this way, we obtain a quantitative measure of the regularity of the coronal hole boundary. Um, the fractal dimension is obtained by plotting in logarithmic scale the number of enclosed points as a function of the cycle radius and calculating the slope of the resulting line, which corresponds to the correlation dimension. The CDM approach extends the traditional methodology by treating each point along the coronal hole boundary as the center of a series of, of a series of concentric cycles, rather than using a single fixed point. This makes it possible to compute a correlation dimension value for every point along of the contour, that is, for each pixel that define the coronal hole boundary. So our result shows the boundary of the coronal hole colored point by point, which each color indicates the value of the local fractal dimension, representing the level of irregularity along the contour. Values near to yellow correspond to more irregular regions, while those closer to blue indicate a more irregular areas. The region of interest is where the jets occur, is outlined in the white box. Uh, in the right side, we present the evolution of the boundary within the select region of interest. It can be seen that at the moment that the jet eruption occurs, due to the magnetic reconnection, the boundary become more irregular than the compared with the preceding moments. So to obtain a complete view of the coronal hole boundary evolution, we average the local correlation dimension values within the region of interest over the time and compare this with the intensity curve of each frame over a 2-hour observation period. So we observed that the jet begin around the 22:25 and end at approximately 23:04:08 Universal Time. The CDM curve for the coronal hole boundary closely follows the evolution of the jet curves. So next, we took the boundaries obtained for each frame, trimmed the head, then fully stretched them and plotted them side by side. This allows us to generate a plot showing the position along the boundary as a function of the time, with the color bar indicating the correlation dimension value. Using the known location and timing of the jet under study, we identify the position on the plot and highlight it with a white box. In this way, we have developed a method that allows us to quantify the spatial and temporal irregularity of the coronal hole boundary associated with the jet eruption caused by interchain reconnection. So we have a new idea. Can we use this graph to look for a new jets? So upon closer inspection, several regions in the graph exhibit transient structures with high correlation dimension value. This suggests that the method could be served as a proxy for detecting jets originating from the edges of coronal holes. The CDM can be interpreted as the footprint left by a jet along the coronal hole boundary. Based on this idea, we select several yellow segments in this plot. We highlighted with white boxes. Using their coordinate and stem state, we searched for a corresponding region of interest in the original data. And we find these three events in the coronal hole boundary. And then, indeed, we found new jets. We found that the events correspond to a jet exhibiting a fan spine magnetic topology in the magnetograms in the down panels, the formation of a breakpoint, and the emergence of the jet, all consistent with the breakout model. So, in summary, we analyze a coronal hole and jet that emerging from this boundary using correlation dimension mapping CDM. We quantify the level of irregularity, and we demonstrate that the correlation dimension follow the jet's temporal evolution. And furthermore, we employing a time-dependent CDM plot, we identify region of high correlation dimension, which when mapped onto the coronal hole boundary correspond to location where the jet observed. So next step include we are currently working on building a robust statistical analysis by repeating the calculate on other coronal holes, on other jet events. Our goal is to obtain measurements of the solar wind speed in the vicinity of the coronal hole, specifically in region of high correlation dimension, in order to investigate whether the slow solar wind originates from these areas. Could we use Solar Orbiter and Parker Solar Probe to measure the contribution of these coronal jets, coronal hole jets to the slow solar wind, or to learn more about their origin? Well, thank you for your attention.